Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. So in my introduction to the Torah reading, I pointed out that it's kind of puzzling, right? So let's look again at the commandment to dwell in the Sukkah. Okay, it's 23, Leviticus 23, 42 and 43. Basukot teshvu shivat yamim, kol ha'ezrach v'Yisrael yeshvu basukot. You shall dwell or live in booths, or Sukkot, let's just not translate Sukkot for a second. 7 days, all citizens in Israel should dwell in Sukkot. Laman yedu dorotechem, so that your generations will know. Ki vasukot hoshavti et bnei Yisrael, that I caused the Israelites to dwell in Sukkot. V'hotzi'i otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Right? The problem is, there's nowhere else in the Torah that it says we dwelt in Sukkot, in booths. Okay, now my rabbi, when I was a kid growing up, explained to us a different explanation, that the Sukkah actually represents the temporary structures that farmers would make during the harvest. And by the way, the few verses before, the Torah also connects Sukkot with the harvest. Okay, now what happened? Because if you've ever, and I mean, granted, most of us are not farmers, right? And probably don't know any farmers, right? And maybe have never even been on a farm, right? But particularly in the ancient world, right? Because you didn't, if you were a farm, you didn't want to live by yourself, remote from everybody else, right? Why not? Because marauders, thieves, crooks would come, and you were vulnerable, right? So people lived in towns, they lived in villages, and then their farm would be out on the outskirts, right? So this is the origin of commuting to work, right? You would go commute to your farm, right, on your donkey or your horse or walk or whatever, and you would farm, and then you come home at night in the village because people gathered together for protection, right? But during the harvest, that was not practical for a couple of reasons. One is that you probably wanted to keep an eye on your crops, because the same marauders who might kill you the rest of the year are going to steal your crops. Also because harvest time, you know, you don't, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I'll knock off, right? I mean, if you don't, whatever you're growing, if you don't pick it on time, it's going to rot in the fields, right? So people work more. So you slept in the fields during the harvest, so you built a booth so you have at least some shelter. Okay, that actually makes sense, right? But the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah has a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, and Eliezer and Akiva have lots of disputes, and the question that they're discussing is, when it says Sukkot, right, they dwelt in Sukkot, okay, well, all right, so they're aware that there's no other verse that says they dwelt in Sukkot, right? So Rabbi Eliezer says, Ananei kavod hayu. Ananei kavod hayu. They were clouds of glory. All right, the Sukkot were not clouds of glory, divine clouds that God provided for our ancestors for them to live in during the 40 years in the desert. Okay, but Rabbi Akiva says, Sukkot mamash asubahem. All right, Sukkot mamash, that Hebrew word mamash, it's a great word, right? I mean, it's kind of like the English literally and how it's become, right? But mamash means like mamash, right? Like really, okay? So Rabbi Akiva says, so Rabbi Eliezer says it's the clouds of glory, right? God made us dwell in clouds of glory. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, it means actual sukkahs, actual booths, right? So we have two opinions, and the Gemara does not resolve this dispute, right? So which one is right? Okay, which one is right? What do you think?
What was it? What was Sukkot first practiced?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's commanded in the Torah, right? It's commanded in the Torah, and, presumably it was practiced. I mean, although, there are, when Deuteronomy was discovered and they realized they weren't doing it exactly right. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not, like, I read religious anthropology, but I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't really.
Well, that's relative to the question. Because if it wasn't practiced in the desert, it was practiced later.
Right.
Then you can't talk about clouds. I don't know how you can talk about clouds of glory.
Right, well, no, I mean, presumably it wasn't practiced in the desert because, I mean, if you take the biblical description, like literally, right, it begins by saying, when you enter the land, at harvest time you shall observe Sukkot, right? Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. Now, because among other things, right, again, I mean, assuming the literal veracity, they didn't harvest in the desert, right? They ate manna, right? So there's no harvest, so there's no harvest time, so there's no Sukkot. It's commemorated, right? As opposed to Pesach, which the Torah says they observed every year in the desert. Okay, so that's a good point. I'm still, I mean, it's clearly a commemoration, right? It's clearly like a retroactive commemoration. Okay, so, I mean, here's what I'm going to say, right? When you have two explanations for any Jewish practice, they're probably both correct, right? Because, I mean, the Torah itself doesn't resolve it. Well, I mean, in a way, I mean, there's also no reference to Ananei Kavod. Right, I mean, there is. There's a cloud of glory that rests on the tabernacle, right? But it doesn't say that the Israelites dwelt in clouds of glory, right? But, so a sukkah mamash, right, a literal booth, right, it's a temporary dwelling. It doesn't have four walls, right? Because if it has four complete walls, it's not a kosher sukkah. It doesn't have a fully covered roof, right? I mean, if you can't see the skies, the stars, then it's not a kosher sukkah, right? It's easy to take down, it's easy to put back up, I mean, relatively, as opposed to, let's say, a house, right? And it's good for travel, but it doesn't really offer true shelter or true security, and there's a lot of inconvenience, right? And when you dwell in a sukkah, I mean, all of my friends in New York were really bummed out because they weren't going to be able to eat in the sukkah last night, and many of them, like, forget it. I mean, their sukkah was destroyed, right? Their sukkah was destroyed, right? So dwelling in a sukkah is embracing your own vulnerability, right? It rejects the fallacy that you have full control and you learn to live in flexibility and fluidity. And I have to say that one of the in my opinion, one of the greatest causes of mental stress in our society among, let's say college-educated people, right, is the idea that we should have full control, right? And the recognition, and I have to say, I mean, like, when I recognize that I'm not in control, it infuriates me, right? It absolutely infuriates me, but that's the reality. We're not always in control, right? And so the cloud is a rejection of, right, the sukkah is a rejection of shelter. Divine cloud is the ultimate shelter, right? Because they were under the direct protection of God, right? It's not just about vulnerability, it's about protection. So there's like, and this is a hard thing to do, is to understand that we're not completely in control, but sometimes by accepting that we're not completely in control, that's when good things can happen, right? Is when, and I'll tell you in my own personal life, okay? I met Kelly several days after, at age 42, I finally accepted to myself the fact that I would never get married, right? I accepted the fact that I was 42 years old, was not married, and would be single the rest of my life and never get married. Okay, and the moment that I accepted the fact that I was 42, single, and would never get married, I met Kelly, right? I mean, is that purely coincidence, or was God looking out for me? I don't know, okay? Because there, as a kind of rationalist, I don't really believe that God is up there like, oh, fine. I don't know. But I don't know how God works, right? But I do know that it doesn't mean that you give up responsibility, right? But it means that you accept the fact that I'm not always in control, right? And maybe when you accept the fact that you're not always in control, something else is looking out for you, and good things can happen. And maybe it is that sort of release of stress and tension that, I'm responsible for everything. Well, I mean, I'm responsible for everything. There's a word for that, megalomania, right? Only I can fix it, right? Sukkot, I think, has at least some of that symbolism. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. And so during Musaf on holidays, we do a full silent Amidah and then a full repetition to allow for duchening for Birkat Kohanim. We turn to Hatzikadosh,